Good afternoon, and welcome to Investopedia's webinar, Getting Rollovers Right. My name is Ruth Konigsberg, and I'm an editor at Investopedia, the world's leading source of financial content, with more than 20 million unique visitors and 60 million page views each month. Today, we are going to be talking about rollover IRAs, which are an extremely important component of retirement security. I'm going to be joined by two experts in rollovers. The first is Timothy Baker, a certified financial planner and founder of WealthShape, an independent advisory firm in Connecticut. Our second guest is Nicholas Holman, also a certified financial planner with Betterment, the largest independent robo-advisor in the country. Before I introduce our guests, I want to give a little context as to why we're doing this webinar and just how much money is at stake with rollover IRAs. There's more money invested in IRAs than any other type of retirement plan, $7.4 trillion as of Q1 2016, according to the Investment Company Institute and the Federal Reserve Board. On average, people change jobs about 12 times in their lifetime. That's a lot of times to have to decide whether or not to roll over your 401k and how to do it. According to a 2014 survey by the Employee Benefit Research Institute of job changers over the age of 50, the most common outcome upon changing jobs was to leave your retirement savings in the previous employer's plan. As we will be explaining, this is usually not the best option, as rollovers usually have more investment options and also more transparency about fees. Here at Investopedia, we've noticed that some of the most common questions users have around rollover IRAs are, 1, how to roll over a 401k to an IRA, and 2, does an IRA rollover count as a contribution? Tim Baker is going to go over the benefits of rollover IRAs compared to 401ks, while Nick Holman has some little-known tax strategies for rollovers to share with us. You can also download this presentation under the resources link. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Timothy Baker of WealthShape, who will start us off on getting rollovers right.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. I appreciate that kind of intro and appreciate all the great work Investopedia does to bring solid education to investors from all walks of life. Investment literacy is certainly something at the heart of everything WealthShape was built on and, frankly, for what it stands for. So to start, we don't have a lot of time to talk. The goal here is to give you a couple of impactful ways in about 30 minutes or so in this webinar that can ultimately open your eyes to some of the key concepts associated with IRA rollovers. So let's begin with the very basic nuts and bolts of 401ks and IRAs so that we're all on the same page. So this chart illustrates the primary retirement vehicles available today. Now, they all offer the important benefit of tax deferral, which allows our investments to grow without the harshness of capital gains or dividends or interest taxation. But outside of that tax-deferred growth, there are some, I would say, major differences. First, looking at your 401k, and these are the accounts offered through your place of work. Normally with a 401k, they come with an employer matching contribution, which is really the element that makes plans sort of unique from the other vehicles. But, of course, that matching ends when you no longer work for the employer. You usually have a fund menu to choose from with about 12 or so investment options. You can make pre-tax contributions of up to $18,000 per year, plus an extra $6,000 a year if you're over age 50. Required distributions from your plan do have to begin at age 70 and a half. Around 2006 or so, the IRS started allowing employers to offer after-tax or Roth options. Now, there's two caveats with the Roth 401k. First, it doesn't pertain to the matching contribution from your company. So when the company matches, that portion is going to go into the traditional pre-tax portion of your 401k. And second, as opposed to the regular standalone Roth IRAs, which we're going to get into in a second, if assets are left in the plan and not rolled over into a Roth IRA, distributions do have to start at age 70 and a half unless you're still working for the company. Now, I kind of want to discuss your individual retirement accounts, which are independent of your employer and really the focus of this discussion on IRA rollovers because they're the primary vehicles for rollovers, right? So first, your traditional IRA, which allows pre-tax contributions up to $5,500 a year plus a $1,000 catch-up contribution for folks over the age of 50. In contrast with 401ks, you're going to have thousands of options, really the investment universe to choose from with regards to IRAs. Now, those same contributions limits pertain to Roth IRAs as well. The major notable difference being that Roth IRAs are funded with after-tax monies, and there's no requirement to take distributions from Roths at age 70 and a half. So this slide was just to lay the groundwork for the rest of our discussion. So why are IRAs in the process of rolling over old 401ks so popular? That's the question we're here to tackle. I think perhaps the best way to look at the benefits of a rollover is with an example. This is a fairly common scenario that I come across pretty much all the time. For illustrative purposes, let's just assume that the same dollar amount is invested in each one of these accounts. So you have an individual that has a traditional IRA invested in a 100% blue chip stock fund. They also have an old 401k that they never rolled over from their first job right out of college. Looks like they were working at Disney. About 80% is invested in Disney stock, and that's an occurrence I find fairly common with employees of Fortune 500 companies. Another 20% is invested in a small cap mutual fund, and next we have old 401k number 2, with 70% invested in a U.S. mid-cap fund, 30% in a real estate fund, and last but not least, we have their current 401k, 60% equity exposure to U.S. large companies, 30% U.S. bonds, and 10% international stocks. So this represents the entire makeup of this individual's retirement portfolio. I think one of the biggest mistakes that I see on a regular basis is that failure to recognize the importance of knowing what your overall asset allocation looks like, and furthermore, how it fits with your retirement strategy. It's never about a single account, but the collection of all of your accounts that's ultimately going to define the likelihood of your success. Moving on to the next slide. The overarching point here, I think, is it's really hard to know what you own when everything is in a bunch of different places. When we look at the big picture, combining all of the underlying assets, all of the accounts, we can see what the true exposure is to these various asset classes. So in this case, 93% of this overall retirement portfolio is invested in equities, most of which are coming from the U.S., with a minimal amount coming from developed international markets, 0% in emerging markets, and it looks like 0% in international bonds. I would say if we were to do a further breakdown of these asset classes, we'd find significant overweight to U.S. large-cap growth companies, largely due to that Disney stock exposure that we saw and the other blue-chip and large-cap holdings. So needless to say, I would not consider this a well-diversified portfolio, with several important asset classes either missing or underrepresented. We know that the practice of proper diversification by maintaining exposure to various asset classes is really one of the best ways to alleviate volatility and to ensure you receive the highest level of return for a given level of risk in your portfolio. Having that 93% exposure in your retirement portfolio, that might be okay for the 25-year-old who enjoys base jumping on the weekends, but it's probably a little high for the skittish 62-year-old that's on the verge of retirement. So back to that question that we alluded to earlier, why are rollovers so popular? I think this exercise of analyzing your total retirement assets is usually one of the more eye-opening exercises that ultimately leads to the consolidating of retirement accounts through IRA rollovers. Looking at the big picture also helps to eliminate overlap. So you often see overlap in portfolios that have a large number of funds. In these situations, it's often the case that the underlying fund manager himself ends up owning many of the same stocks. In effect, the end investor is having too much exposure to one particular company, and that certainly could be the case in this example with Disney stock. So overlap is one of those things you want to look to eliminate, and one of the benefits of a rollover. And now on to the increased number of investment options and guidance. As we previously mentioned, 401k fund choices are fairly minimal in comparison to the thousands of options to choose from within the context of an IRA. Typically see 12 to 20 funds, In many cases, what I find is there's a lack of options covering all the necessary asset classes for proper diversification. Real estate comes to mind as an example of an asset class I often see missing from 401k fund options. I think that increased choice is probably one of the more obvious benefits to investors choosing to roll over their old 401ks. The next or the second half of that discussion really is another differentiator, and this is one of the more common complaints I find from 401k participants, and that's a general lack of guidance. I think we can all appreciate the value of good advice regardless of the medium it comes from. So with so many commitments on our time these days, be it work or family, it makes sense to seek professional guidance in order to focus on those things that you do best and things you care about most. Portfolios should evolve through the years, both with new research and with life events. So having that objective person working in your best interest can certainly help to insulate you from becoming complacent or making any types of poor decisions. Increased fee transparency, and this is one of the things Ruth alluded to at the top of the presentation. Many of you on the call have probably seen John Oliver's now infamous rant on the lack of transparency and general lack of understanding of 401k plans. I would say it's rare to come across investors who have a true understanding of all the underlying fees. Plans have a number of fees, including record keeping, administrative, advisory, internal fund expenses. Uncovering these fees, I can tell you, is a daunting task. And to be perfectly honest with you, a whole lot of financial advisors don't have a good handle on it either. Lots of plans, I find, still have really expensive funds that pay commissions to brokers every time contributions are made. I often see administrative fees bundled together and attached to fees coming from actual mutual fund options themselves. So altogether, this results in a lack of transparency and very often high expenses. In case you're interested in delving down into the fees associated with your plan, there is a requirement by the Department of Labor that comes out every year, a fee disclosure document called a 408B2. I know you probably won't remember that, but the fee disclosure document is required, and it will help. Failure to rebalance your portfolio is another big mistake. The process of rebalancing your portfolio ensures that it stays in line with your overall risk tolerance and goals. Now remember, in most cases, your portfolio isn't limited to that one or two accounts, but the entire investment picture. The act of rebalancing has benefits above and beyond simply keeping your portfolio in line with your risk tolerance. So the age-old adage on successful investing is what? It's buying low and selling high, right? Well, in effect, rebalancing your portfolio actually does just that by selling portions that have appreciated the most and then buying those that have underperformed or appreciated less. So moving forward to a couple of things that you're going to want to consider when doing a rollover. Now, keep in mind, you can only roll over your old, not your current 401k plans. So if you do plan on retiring early, the IRS rule of 55 applies if you get laid off or you get fired or you quit your job, and you're between the age of 55 and 59 and a half. For those few years, you're allowed to pull money from your 401k or your 403b without penalty. Now, of course, again, the caveat is, of course, the rule only applies to your current 401k, not the older ones. Institutional group buying power. This point really pertains to the actual fund options within the plan itself. So due to the large amount of overall assets and number of participants that many plans have, economies of scale start to kick in. And what that really means is that in some cases, 401k investors may have access to fund share classes that have lower expenses than that are available to your individual investors. Now, admittedly, increased access to low-cost solutions outside of plans has sort of diminished this point, but it's still relevant to mention, when you're analyzing the options. The loss of a loan provision, and this is a common misconception, and one of the reasons I think a lot of people hold on to their 401k plans. Some investors think that you'll lose the ability to take out a loan if you roll over your 401k into an IRA, when the truth is you lost that provision when you left your job. So it's important to recognize that a loan provision is one of the unique characteristics that we didn't get to at the top of the conversation about 401k plans, but it only applies when you do still have a working relationship with your employer. If you've left the job, then there's no way to pay back that loan via payroll deduction, therefore the loan provision goes away. In terms of the advisory landscape and access to quality advice, I'd say that this might be a moot point for educated investors, but it shouldn't go unmentioned that sometimes a large number of choices isn't always a good thing. I tend to be a big believer that every investor should at least have a principal understanding of how their money is invested. But if you're unwilling to do so, it's argumentative that not rolling over your old 401k might make more sense. For instance, I tend not to be the biggest fan of annuities, but I'm really not a fan of them being used in already tax-deferred accounts such as IRAs. And I meet with a fair amount of clients where this happens to be the case. And it usually stems from not having a thorough understanding of investment and advisory alternatives. In terms of company stock considerations, this is the last point that I'll mention. In the case where you do have a portion of your 401k invested in company stock, there are some tax considerations to be aware of. Getting into the minutia of net unrealized appreciation is a bit deep for the time we have today. But you should know that if you own company stock in your old plan, you'll want to do some additional research or consult a tax advisor prior to rolling over assets.
Thanks, Tim. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. This is Nick from Betterment. So Betterment is really excited to partner with Investopedia, especially on a topic so important as retirement rollovers. So as Tim mentioned, rolling over your old 401k can help improve your investment strategy. Another good point is that any good financial plan also factors in taxes. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. Consolidating your old 401k can make it much easier to implement a number of tax strategies that can help increase the longevity of your retirement nest egg. So on the surface, IRAs and 401ks are both taxed in the same manner. Money goes in pre-tax. It will grow tax-free while the money is still within the account. And then withdrawals are treated as ordinary income and taxed according to your tax bracket. But when we dive into the details, we see that rolling over and consolidating your old 401k can in fact lead to huge tax benefits. We don't have enough time to dive too deep into any single topic, but what I wanted to make sure that you were aware of are the three main tax strategies that Betterment uses with our clients when it comes to managing rollovers and retirement accounts. And those three strategies are asset location, Roth conversions, and tax loss harvesting. So let's start with asset location. This is a strategy designed to improve your after-tax returns across all your accounts. Betterment, Vanguard, and Morningstar have all thoroughly researched this strategy, and our back tests have shown that it can add about 0.5% per year in returns. So over 30 years, which is a typical retirement time horizon, that means an extra 15% in your pocket. The way that asset location works is by reorganizing your investments across multiple accounts according to how they are taxed. Just to give a quick example, for both U.S. and international stocks, they should both be part of your overall retirement portfolio, but U.S. stocks are more tax efficient because they pay qualified dividends, while dividends from international stocks are actually taxed at higher rates. And what that means to you as an investor is that you should prioritize holding U.S. stocks in taxable accounts and holding your international stocks in IRAs because of the tax benefits that come with IRAs that we discussed earlier. And this means that you should look across all your accounts, taxable, traditional, and Roth, and reorganize where you hold each investment, which doing so can require constant monitoring and rebalancing of your accounts, which is why consolidating them and rolling over your old 401ks is so important. At Betterment, we've automated asset location but any good advisor should also be able to implement this strategy and manage it for you on an ongoing basis as well. So that's asset location. The second strategy I wanted to discuss is called Roth conversions. And a Roth conversion is another amazing retirement strategy where you move money from traditional retirement accounts over to Roth accounts. Now, you pay taxes for doing so, but once the money is held within the Roth accounts, all future earnings and withdrawals will be tax-free. So this is a really important strategy to do when you find yourself in a low tax bracket. Some examples of years that you might find yourself in a low bracket are if you retire before you start taking Social Security, or maybe you are quote-unquote semi-retired and you still have income, but you find yourself in a lower bracket because of that. You know that you'll pay taxes eventually on your IRA withdrawals down the road or your future RMDs, so why not take advantage of the lower rate while you have the chance? And that's when Roth conversions come in handy. However, executing an effective conversion from a 401k instead of from an IRA poses one main potential problem, and that is that unlike with IRAs, if you do a conversion from your 401k, you can't undo the conversion. So let's say you have a larger than expected bonus that increases your income this year. If you did the conversion from an IRA, you can simply undo it. It's called a recharacterization, and it's like it never happened, so you can avoid the higher tax consequences. Now, this is not true if you did a 401k conversion. You're stuck with it. So if you plan to use Roth conversions in your personal retirement strategy, rolling the money into an IRA is definitely the way to go. So that's Roth conversions. The third and last strategy that I wanted to mention with regard to rollovers today was tax loss harvesting. So tax loss harvesting is another way to use your investment to reduce your taxes. And how it works is you monitor your portfolio for losses and sell them to get a tax write-off. And whenever you tax loss harvest, you have to be careful about the IRS wash sale rule, which is when you buy a similar investment within 30 days of taking the loss. And if you aren't careful, then that loss will actually be disallowed, meaning you can't benefit from the loss. And this rule applies to trading that takes place within your retirement accounts as well. So even though you cannot harvest in your IRAs or 401ks, it's still important to monitor and coordinate your trades within those accounts. And that's the main reason why rolling over and consolidating your 401k makes it so much easier to implement an effective tax loss harvesting strategy. Without consolidation, this level of monitoring is pretty difficult. Now, since we've been talking about the benefits of rollovers this whole webinar, what I wanted to do is end the webinar with a little bonus, something called a reverse rollover. And this is actually when you roll over your IRA into your 401k instead of the other way around like we've been discussing. And most of the time, this is not the best option, but there is one scenario where it can make sense. And you would possibly want to do a reverse rollover when your traditional IRA has a mix of both pre-tax and after-tax money held in it. And this can occur if your income was too high in one or a few years to take the IRA tax deduction for making contributions. So if this is the case, you could easily have a mix of pre-tax and after-tax money in your IRA, and a reverse rollover could be highly beneficial. The way that it works is you roll your pre-tax portion of your IRA back into your 401k. And what that does is it leaves your IRA with only after-tax money, which then you can convert directly to a Roth without paying any taxes. And then again, once the money is in the Roth, all the future growth and withdrawals will be tax-free. So this is one of the most pain-free ways to load up your Roth accounts. So we talked about 3 tax strategies that you can implement more effectively after rolling over your 401k and consolidating your accounts into your IRAs. Those 3 strategies, again, were asset location, Roth conversions, and tax loss harvesting. And we also discussed the one scenario where you should actually do the opposite, a reverse rollover. Hopefully, one or more of these applies to your situation, and you can use them to improve your overall retirement plan.
Thank you, Nick. That's great. And thank you, Tim, as well, for laying out all the sort of groundwork information that we need to know about these vehicles, which can get a bit complicated. We do have some time for questions, so and we have some good ones. So I'm going to start off with this one. The question is, can you roll a 401k Roth into a regular Roth IRA? And are there differences between the two?
That's a great question. Okay, Tim, go ahead and take that.
Well, the answer is yes. In fact, that's what you'll want to do. A lot of since the provision came in place about 10 years ago, it's really important for people to remember that you never want to commingle assets. So when monies do come out of your 401k plan, there's going to be a pre-tax and a post-tax. Essentially, if you're rolling it over, there should be two checks, right? One should go to a Roth IRA, one should go to a traditional IRA, and you won't want to commingle those two because it ends up becoming, I guess what you would call it an accounting nightmare to prove to the IRS that they weren't pre-tax and post-tax. So that is absolutely what has to happen, and what everybody, certainly should do.
Great. Thank you. So here's another question that's interesting. The question is, are you going to discuss self-directed IRAs, by which I'm going to interpret the question being, how do they fit into this whole landscape? I just learned this morning that, in fact, you have to find your own sponsor if you're going to have a self-directed IRA, and very few companies actually do that. But let's see. I'm not sure who would want this. Maybe Nick, are you familiar with self-directed IRAs?
Yeah, so self-directed IRAs, they can allow you to have a couple more different investment options than your traditional IRAs at a typical custodian. Some of those examples are real estate and things like that. We typically don't see them very often. They tend to have higher fees and some liquidity issues, but if you are a pretty savvy investor out there, that is another option. Typically, we don't recommend them to our average customer, though.
Okay, that's good to know. Here's another question. I'm in the process of converting my IRA to a Roth, but should I be contributing to my Roth as I do this, or focus on finishing my conversion first? I guess it probably doesn't really, not sure if it matters, but Tim, what do you think?
Yeah, so let's pick that question apart. So you're in the process of doing a Roth conversion. Now, the first and foremost, one thing you do have to understand, in order to make contributions to an IRA, you do have to have earned income for that particular year. So assuming that you do have earned income for that year, there's really nothing that's going to prevent you from making that contribution level, other than taking into consideration how much you're making on an annual basis. So if you, the one thing that we didn't get to because our time is a little bit truncated here, is with regards to IRAs, there are going to be limits. If, for instance, you happen to be an active participant in a 401k plan, there are going to be income limits based on your tax filing status, where you may or may not be able to make IRA contributions. And those are found in your typical tax tables from the IRS every year. So assuming that you fit into that criteria where you can make contributions, it really isn't going to be all that statistically relevant in the long run in terms of when that conversion actually takes place. But keep in mind, the amount of assets that you do convert is obviously going to be taxable from a traditional IRA to a Roth IRA. So it's one of those things that we do as advisors to sort of fill up the tax buckets, we sort of call it, to ensure that we're not providing you with too much taxable income in a given year and making that conversion process as tax efficient as possible.
Okay, great. I think we have time for about one more question, and this is an interesting one for Nick that relates to tax loss harvesting. Sorry, the question came in as tax law. Question being, is tax loss harvesting for those with higher incomes? Nick, are there any income minimum requirements, or is it just, or appropriateness factors when looking at tax loss harvesting?
Great question. So income definitely does come into play when you're looking at whether tax loss harvesting makes sense for you or not. Typically, the higher income, the higher tax bracket you are going to be in, the more benefit you're going to see from tax loss harvesting just because your tax rates are higher. Now, if you're in the 15% bracket or less, so the 10 or 15% bracket, which will depend on if you're single or married, but those bottom two brackets, you actually should not be tax loss harvesting. And that's because when you're in those two brackets, the way that the tax code works on capital gains is actually flipped. So you don't pay any taxes on capital gains. So in that case, tax loss harvesting would not make sense if you're in those bottom two brackets. It definitely does make sense if you're above those, and especially in the higher brackets as well.
Okay, great. Thanks for the clarification. Thank you all for joining us today. There's a lot more to learn, and we will try to respond to individual questions that we didn't get to directly. And once again, I want to thank Tim Baker and Nick Coleman for their time and their insights today. And we appreciate your joining us today. Okay, thanks.